Hey everyone, Alexander here for another installment of 30 Days of Symphony, and as I have the great pleasure to introduce another installment in our survey of the 9 amazing symphonies by Antonin Dvorak, along with Tchaikovsky and Brahms, unquestionably the greatest symphonist, the greatest composer of symphonies of the later 19th century. We have experienced together the long struggle of Dvorak's life and career, growing up in very humble circumstances in a little village in the Bohemian hinterlands in the early 19th century, not showing particularly brilliant talent as a child in music, but by dint of his own innate talent, a talent that had yet to kind of present itself, his own self-belief, his own work ethic and determination, Dvorak had by the early 1880s become, again, along with Brahms and Tchaikovsky, the most successful composer in Europe. Indeed, by the middle 1880s, both Wagner and Liszt have passed on, and it's like these four pillars of Western classical music. You have these four titanic figures in the world of symphony and opera. You have Brahms in Germany, Tchaikovsky in Russia, Dvorak in Bohemia, and then let us not forget, down in Italy, we have the great genius composer of opera of that time, Giuseppe Verdi. These four composers were all deservedly very successful as the great composers of their time. By this point, they had all become quite wealthy men, and deservedly so. They were all essentially self-made characters who had made their way in the musical world, again, by the sheer force of their own talent and determination. Well, by 1885, Dvorak has composed his Seventh Symphony, though he referred to it as his sixth because his first symphony, as you may recall, had, when he was a very young and poverty-stricken man, had been written in one manuscript copy and sent off to a competition somewhere in Austria, and it didn't win the first prize, and he couldn't afford to have it sent back to him. So he had assumed it was lost forever. Indeed, it was not discovered until 1926 in an antiquarian bookshop in Prague. So for Dvorak, his Seventh Symphony was his Sixth Symphony, but for his very haughty, and I must say rather bigoted publisher in Berlin, Fritz Zimrock, his Sixth Symphony, his Seventh Symphony was his Second Symphony, because that's how Zimrock published it. And his Fifth Symphony was his Third Symphony. So the Symphony number 8, which Dvorak got to composing in 1889, was published as his Fourth Symphony in G major. But by the 1950s, thankfully, Dvorak's symphonies were finally accurately renumbered, and we have come to know and love it and embrace it as the Symphony number 8. With the Seventh Symphony, again, what we now realize is the Seventh Symphony, written in 1885, Dvorak had composed a Brahmsian, kind of traditional Germanic symphony in the manner of Brahms, that in the Brahmsian manner that was as great as, every bit as great as Brahms himself in the Brahmsian manner. It was kind of like he had always, to his dying day, he revered Johannes Brahms. Brahms was, of course, the slightly older and much more influential composer in Vienna who had literally given Dvorak his first break back in 1874, recommending him for that imperial stipend given by the Austrian Ministry of Education, which literally provided Dvorak the lifeline with which he could finally concentrate on composing. But with the Seventh Symphony, Dvorak, if ever the phrase were true, he beats Brahms at his own game. He proves to the entire musical world, and at this point in time, the entire musical world basically meant the German-speaking lands. what we now refer to as Germany and Austria, which was the center of the action for classical symphonic music. Of course, Italy being the center for opera, France being the center for ballet. And he accomplished this miracle of the Seventh Symphony by writing a work that was utterly compact, concise, and structurally perfect in his design. Now you'll remember over the course of Dvorak's 9 symphonies, Dvorak, he did have a very fine basic training technically in music at the Prague Organ School. He had ventured from his little small town in Bohemia to Prague to learn how to be a church organist. And he had a very thorough grounding, but as a composer of music, he was utterly self-taught. And whereas his friend and mentor Brahms was, in that North German manner, was severely self-critical, so that he left the world 4 symphonies, but it's kind of common knowledge that he threw certainly just as many symphonies into the fireplace in fits of self-doubt. Dvorak kind of published his symphonies, and so those first 2 symphonies of Dvorak are so again, this as I've said before, this cornucopia of beautiful melodies, but very structurally unorganized and rather long-winded and verbose. But it's in that process of writing symphonies, often in pairs, the 3rd and the 4th symphonies written together, the 5th and the 6th symphonies together, and then in the mid and late 1880s, these 7th and 8th symphonies are really written ultimately, kind of cosmically, as kind of a pair of works that are, as I said with those previous pairs of symphonies, the 7th and 8th symphonies are really, you need to see them as kind of 2 different sides of the same coin. So with the 7th Symphony in that ultimate Beethovenian key of D minor, remember Beethoven's 9th symphony is in D minor. And composers in the 19th century were always signaling to their audiences by their choice of key signatures. In the 7th Symphony, Brahms again writes this totally Germanic, absolute symphony in which he kind of beats the Germans at their own game. In the Symphony number 8, he gives us a masterpiece of radiant nationalism. This utterly joyous, bucolic, pastoral symphony that is full of Slavic-inspired melodies and full of musical imagery of the beautiful Czech countryside in which Dvorak literally wrote this symphony. He wrote it in the summer of 1889 in a kind of summer mansion, a little compound that the Kingdom of Bohemia, the Bohemian regional government, had kind of bequeathed to him. By the later 1880s, again, Dvorak, as I've said, is along with kind of Verdi, Tchaikovsky, and Brahms. He's just one of the great composers of Europe. And the governmental authorities realize they've got a star on their hands, so they quite deservedly give Dvorak and his large, wonderful family a summer residence with its own complete, fields and woodlands in which Dvorak would wander around for his afternoon walks. It's literally that atmosphere. You can, in the 8th Symphony, you have this set of musical pictures in which you can literally, I know this sounds kind of quaint, but you literally can sense, the wind murmuring through the trees and the babbling brooks and the singing birds and the beauty of the sunset, in the countryside. It's all there. And the Bohemian countryside of what we call the Czech lands, Bohemia and Moravia, it really is a lot like the Cooley region around La Crosse. It's this very kind of pre-Alpine atmosphere of fields and forests, and I think that's one of the reasons why when Dvorak came to America in the early 1890s, he felt very much at home, as some of you may know, in the upper Midwest. He spent a summer, of course, in the Bohemian colony of Spillville, Iowa, which was a wonderful time for all concerned, at a time he always looked back on very fondly. It's that utterly bucolic summer atmosphere in which Dvorak writes his Symphony Number 8. But this, my friends, is no walk in the park. It is not like Dvorak is taking a break from the discipline of symphonic writing, having mastered it for all the world to see in the Symphony Number 7. No, no. In the Symphony Number 8, again, we have this truly Czech symphonic masterpiece, but it is no, it may have been written during a summer vacation, but it is no vacation from the discipline of symphonic writing, because here in the Symphony Number 8, he not only gives us, Dvorak is always, his symphonies are always unique. Each one is unique, like each of Beethoven's symphonies is unique in form and content. And here in the Symphony Number 8, he not only gives us a symphony of utterly new and unique content, the musical traditions of the Czech Bohemian folk tradition, and this bucolic atmosphere of musical tone painting, but he gives us also, crucially, a new concept of symphonic form. And Dvorak, while writing this symphony, and opposite of the Seventh Symphony, which had a very protracted birth, shall we say. It took several months for him to compose. It was written kind of as the culmination of a personal struggle for him, in which he, not unlike Tchaikovsky, was kind of asking himself, am I a Slavic composer, or am I a more Germanic, cosmopolitan, European composer? As opposed to the Seventh Symphony's composition, the Eighth Symphony he wrote in a matter of days. He wrote the first movement itself, which is a miracle, in all of 2 weeks. The finale took a few days to write, and then he took over about a month he orchestrated it. But basically, the symphony was written in under a month, which is amazing. And while he was composing this symphony, he wrote, as one would do. They didn't have telephones or email, so he would write letters every day, which is what everyone did then. And he wrote to friends 2 very telling phrases. He said, the first thing he said, which was unforgettable, is he said, quote, "The melodies simply pour out of me." And whereas in the Seventh Symphony, he has perfected the Brahmsian technique of developing variation. Remember that phrase bequeathed to us by Arnold Schoenberg in the early 20th century? Brahms is the genius of this original technique called developing variation, where Dvorak in his Seventh Symphony and his Sixth Symphony, very much like Brahms, would give you a tiny little melodic cell, or a set of 2 or 3 little cells made up of 2 or 3 or 4 notes. That's it. And from that, he would develop an entire symphonic movement. In the Symphony Number 8, it is just a profusion, a cornucopia of beautiful melodies. But, my friends, not the cornucopia of melodies as they were in the first 2 symphonies, where again, there's no organization. Here you have this cornucopia of beautiful melodies, but they are so tightly organized and controlled, and that there is, again, by this point in Dvorak's career as a composer, this guy can do anything he wants. He can do anything he wants. And as in the symphonies of Beethoven, not one note is extraneous. So he takes these 2 beautiful melodies that you'll hear at the beginning. And the other amazing thing about this symphony is constantly playing off major and minor keys against each other. So the first idea is this very solemn kind of what sounds like a slow march, although it's actually in the tempo of the entire first movement, but it's very solemn and it's in G minor. And then directly from that, you get this bird call idea in the flute, which is in G major, this gentle, it's literally as close as you can get in 19th century music to hearing a bird sing. It really is. And then above that, the piccolo leads the orchestra in to the next movement, which is like a fast, very happy kind of march-like, not a tragic march, but a joyous, lighthearted march idea. And then the melodies just keep pouring out, but then it's the way he very creatively uses that slow, solemn G minor introduction as a kind of signpost at the beginning, middle, and end of the movement. So he blends a kind of 3-part form with the age-old German, of course it begins in Italy in Baroque opera, but what has become a very Germanic form called sonata form. He melds that with this, again, this kind of, it's like a bridge where you hear this solemn G minor idea at the beginning, the middle, and then the beginning of the end. All via this, again, this beautiful, non-stop kind of procession of melodies. The slow movement is Dvorak in his mode as a composer of symphonic pictures, of musical poems. And this is, again, this almost postcard perfect kind of pastoral vision, a beautiful summer afternoon in the Bohemian countryside with, again, kind of a village march. It's like a village band has come through in the middle, and they're kind of playing an arrangement of something by Wagner. But that's the one, and then the carnival is kind of interrupted by a thunderstorm, and then the very gentle bucolic opening music returns. Again, it's just a gentle tone picture, but again, one that is organized down to the tiniest detail. Again, not the smallest, shortest note in this piece is extraneous, is out of place. The scherzo is another miracle of Dvorak's Bohemian nationalist style. Here we get not one of his typical Slavonic dances. You remember in the Sixth and the Seventh Symphonies, you had the music that was redolent of that amazing Czech dance form, that Slavonic dance form called the furiant, where the sense of duple and triple times are constantly in kind of superimposition. It's like two superimposed on three, like da 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 da, all that kind of stuff, and that kind of stomping thing going on. Very rustic, very very bohemian. Here we get a waltz, but it's a bohemian waltz. It's very wistful and melancholy, the typical of the Czech national character. But it's, again, Dvorak may be proving that the Germanic and Slavonic temperaments can be married together. Remember, Dvorak was a passionate Czech patriot to the core, but he wasn't, amongst his Bohemian colleagues, he was seen as not quite politically correct enough, in that he to his dying day, he favored the self-determination of the Czech peoples, but he always thought that they should loosely remain within this great multicultural Habsburg Empire. And I have to say, he was probably proved right, because the experiment in nationalism after 1918 ultimately proved disastrous in the conflict of the Second World War, and then the Cold War and the Iron Curtain which followed. So looking back, the Habsburg Empire wasn't such a bad arrangement, but that's, hindsight is 2020. Again, this wistful mercurial waltz of a third movement ends again with this musical vision. By now, Dvorak, he's like kind of a bantamweight prize fighter who can turn on a dime with a knockout punch. And he does this at the very end of the third movement, where you think he's written this charming, wistful, mercurial, bohemian waltz, and you think it's just going to fade into the distance, but then he suddenly gives you this quick bit of kind of Tchaikovsky ballet music in duple time. It's like something out of the Nutcracker. It's bizarre. And then that fades into the distance. And you just, when you hear this for the first time, or even if it's not the first time, if you hear a great performance of it, like a great orchestra and a great conductor, you just think, what the heck was that? It's like a flock of birds that flew by out of nowhere. It's an incredible, if ever the phrase were true, a stroke of genius. Well, a stroke of genius is the phrase that could describe the finale, in which, again, that the other letter, remember I said Dvorak was, of course, writing letters to friends and colleagues, corresponding with people while he wrote this Symphony No. 8 in all of like 3.5 weeks. The other thing he said, which is so memorable, he wrote to a friend that he was writing this new symphony in G major, and it was going to be a symphony of, as he said, quote, individual themes worked out in an entirely new way. And again, as opposed to the Seventh Symphony, the themes are not in the Brahmsian Germanic manner of, of these melodic cells that you draw out a movement from. He was going to express his thoughts in an organizationally new manner, but with equal discipline. And the ultimate example of that is the last movement, in which he takes another great traditional form, the theme and variations, this lovely idea, which if you listen carefully, it's like a solemn, slow march version of the bird call idea at the very beginning of the first movement. The first movement, the da dee dun da dun da dun da dun da da da, now becomes dun dun dee da da dee da 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 dee da. It's this grand march, solemn but joyous, led once again as they had at the beginning of the first movement, led by the cello section. Again, you might not even notice it if you didn't know, but that was the case, where he had taken this theme from the main theme of the first movement and makes it the main theme of the last movement. But his melodic gift, his inventive gift, is so brilliant that it results in utter spontaneity. You would never feel that this was some pedantic exercise of, oh, look how I took the main idea of the first theme and turned it into the main idea of the finale. It's not like he's doing some final exam and trying to impress the teacher. It's utterly spontaneous, and it's utterly, again, the symphony written on his summer vacation, utterly, if I may say so, organic. This theme, again, which is based on this theme, which is based on the main theme of the first movement, is the theme of this set of amazing variations that will compose the entire scope of the finale. And it is this idea, this G major idea, which again, it's just a G major chord that he's turned into this unforgettable melody. Again, his genius as a melodist cannot be described in words, really. Along with Tchaikovsky, the greatest melodist of all the great composers. And this theme is subjected to the most varied set of variations. They range from happy to sad to tragic to triumphant. There's a final wistful coda where everything becomes hushed and almost religious, very spiritual. And then the joyous fervor returns and built to an amazing climax. This symphony was popular from the day of its premiere in Vienna, Berlin, Frankfurt, Cambridge, England, where by this point Dvorak, as Mendelssohn had been a generation before, Dvorak was absolutely adored by the English musical public, so much so that Dvorak had the symphony published not in Berlin by Zimrock, who once again was trying to cheat him out of his deserved fee, but instead Dvorak has it published in London, and and he actually conducted a performance of it in Cambridge, England, and was awarded with an honorary doctorate by Cambridge University the very next day. A very famous story. The symphony became instantly popular the world over, and to us Midwesterners, let us never forget that Dvorak took great pleasure in conducting this Symphony No. 8 with an enlarged version of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. So a symphony that all of us can take to our hearts. Dvorak's joyously radiant Symphony No. 8 in G major.